Hey everybody, Mike here. So glad you're tuning in. Hope you're having a great week wherever you are, whatever you're doing. Thanks for letting us be a part of your life. Thank you for those of you that like, subscribe, support. Man, you guys are such an amazing community, and so very blessed to be a part of it. Today, so next podcast, I want to start a series on how to be political in these days. It's just so nasty and so crazy, and it seems like it's getting worse and worse and worse. And so I want to start a series that's different than the Jesus and Politics series that we did earlier in the podcast. I want to look at a bit at how the gospel itself is political and how it informs how we are political. And so I hope that'll be helpful. I'm kind of excited about it. But today, I starting to lead a little Bible study for some college guys who lead Young Life in the Columbus area. And they wanted to go through the book of Genesis, which is one of my favorites. Particularly Genesis 1 through 3. And I've always dreamt about doing a extended sort of study in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. I just find it so fundamental and so interesting. And so I was preparing for that, and there are a couple of things that I came across that I'd never heard before, and were totally mind-blowing, at least for me. So this is a Bible Geek episode, but it has some massive implications in terms of how you understand Christianity's relationship to science. And because that's one of the huge issues in Genesis, how do we understand the book of Genesis in its relationship to the accounts it gives of the origins of the universe versus 21st century Western accounts of the origins of the universe, and how do all those reconcile? So a couple of preliminary questions. First, I want to always remind us why it is that we study the Old Testament. And, there are a couple very obvious examples to kind of give about why it is that we study it. And one that comes to mind is watching Infinity War. My kids, or at least my oldest son, and my daughter too, my wife, we are Marvel movie fans and have very much enjoyed the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so we went to see Infinity War opening night. And if you haven't seen it, I mean, that movie is like the culmination of 10 years and 18 or 19 other movies. I mean, it's incredibly, the whole world has been, very thoroughly, incredibly knit together. And I would imagine as I was sitting there watching the movie, I was thinking of somebody who'd never seen any of the previous Marvel movies, and they walked into Infinity War, what their experience would be like. And obviously, the movie's clear enough in its basic elements that you know who the good guys are, you know who the bad guy is, you know what the conflict seems to be about. But so you got the basics, no question about it. But you miss so much detail, and you're liable to misinterpret a lot of the detail because you're not familiar with how the basics have been fleshed out previously. And so when we come to the Old Testament, the particularly the first 5 books, they kind of introduce us to the fundamental storyline, the fundamental plot conflict, the fundamental promises that Jesus both contributes to and brings to completion. And I love how one scholar puts it, and I think this is very, very true. The Gospels of Jesus teach us how to read the Old Testament, and at the same time, the Old Testament teaches us how to read the Gospels. We learn to read the Old Testament by reading backwards from the Gospels, and at the same time, we learn to read the Gospels by reading forwards from the Old Testament. And Jesus is the one who gives us permission to do this. In the end of Luke, Jesus is walking along with 2 of his disciples who are dejected. He's been crucified. They don't recognize him along the road. And Jesus says he opens their minds and begins to explain to them how the law and the prophets were actually about him. And one of the very interesting things is that when you get to the Gospels, yes, you can get the basic storyline and the basic points and ethical teaching, and yes, of course. But there's so much that you miss, and there's so much that we are liable to misinterpret because we haven't seen the prequel. we're not operating in the world. I mean, like the biggest critique of Infinity War is that it assumed a basic knowledge of all the other movies, and exactly. I mean, the Gospels, when you study the life of Jesus, it assumes a working knowledge of the worldview, the promises, the conflicts, the plot lines of what had come before. So one of the reasons we read the Old Testament is to familiarize ourselves with the scriptures that Jesus was using and referring to and fulfilling and extending and all sorts of things. The second reason that we read the Old Testament is that, and the Old Testament is comprised of lots of little bitty stories, but they begin to add up to a much larger plot line over the course of pages and pages and pages. It's kind of like, I heard one scholar use this example. It's kind of like the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis's, it's, quote, children's books, although they're incredibly spiritual and there's a ton of depth to them. There's the main character's name is Aslan, and he's the Christ figure, and he's this big lion. And even though Aslan isn't on all of the pages and isn't in all of the stories, the books very clearly, the little stories very clearly all build a world in which Aslan is the central figure. And so yes, although you're looking in the Old Testament, you're like, what are these numbers and these genealogies, and holy cow, what's God doing here? And I don't understand this. And no question, it raises just as many questions as it answers. But when you get to the Gospels and you open the Gospels and you read about Jesus attending feasts and keeping the Sabbath and arguing with other Jews about the nuances of the law, I mean, this is all within the context of the Old Testament. So I just don't think you can set the Old Testament aside. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that we don't read it with Jesus in view. It just means that if you're going to understand the kind of the worldview of Jesus, you have to have the Old Testament in mind. Its promises, its worldview. I mean, all of that, and that allows Jesus to make so much more sense. So, when you get to the Old Testament, one of the fundamental things that we do is that we allow it to dictate the terms. Right? We are consistently against a very flat reading of the Bible, where we just pick it up in English and say, well, okay, so here's this verse in Genesis, God must mean we do this, and here's this verse in Leviticus, so we do this, and here's this verse in Matthew, and then here's this verse in Paul, and you just kind of take it all flatly and all literally, and there's no room for nuance or literary genre. We're very much against that, because that doesn't honor how the text has come to us. And so when we get to the book of like Genesis, we realize we're dealing with different kinds of literature than what we're normally used to, and so I'll spare you the gory details about what kind of literature Genesis turns out to be, but it becomes very, very important when we get to kind of chapter 1, which is this very famous kind of poetic narrative about the origins of the universe, and so I want to focus kind of on one very big important distinction that I'd heard before, but then I began to read about it and was like, oh my goodness, if this is true, this really changes some of the text. Now, I'm getting this primarily from a guy by the name of John Sailhamer, who is an incredible Old Testament scholar. He's written an Old Testament commentary. He's written several books, but one book he's written that I've just began to devour is a book called Genesis Unbound. And this guy, Paul Sailhamer, or Paul's a guy I worked with, John Sailhamer. John Sailhamer does some things and considers Genesis 1 and 2 in some ways that I think are completely mind-blowing and have proved influential to some other Old Testament scholars that I know personally and that I have huge respect for. So I think there's something to this. I'm going to do my best to explain it, but here's the payoff. The payoff that of the pain we're just going to go through here in the next couple of minutes. The payoff is that a lot of the questions and debates we have about Genesis 1 aren't answered in Genesis 1, but the author is purposefully not trying at all in any way, shape, or form to convey the kind of information that we're looking to Genesis 1 to provide. And so I think there is a massive lifting of pressure for people of faith to try to square cosmic origins with the Genesis, a very literal reading of the Genesis 1 account. I think the Genesis 1 account is, I think it is authoritative, it is inspired, absolutely. But I don't know anymore if it's trying to provide science or not, in a very narrowly construed understanding of the term. So, the Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then verse 3, God begins this cycle where God says, let there be light, there was light. God saw the light was good. He separated it from the darkness. He called the light day, the darkness he called night. There was evening, there was morning the first day. And thus begins this repetitive, 6-day cycle where God seems to be creating and fashioning the earth and the heavens. Now, the big debate, and again, I'm just riffing on Sailhamer here, but I thought it was worth sharing because for people like me who grew up when the evolution and creation debates were really hot and thick and divisive, we realize we've really spent a lot of time arguing over the wrong kind of thing. So this is worth setting up. One of the big questions that Sailhamer addresses is verse 1 a preview of the rest of the verse, or like a title for the rest of chapter 1, not the rest of the verse, but the rest of the chapter, is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, a summary of what God's about to do, and then he begins creating the heavens and the earth in verse 2, now the earth was formless and void and whatever, or it is literally verse 1 telling us that's when God created the heavens and the earth. God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. Period. That was his creation. That was the whole thing. That was him creating the animals and the heavens and everything in between, all except human beings. Is the big event? Is Genesis 1 describing two different events? The first event is the creation of the heavens and earth in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then there's a separate event in verse 2. Now the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit was hovering over the deep. And then God said, let there be light. So are we describing one event or two? Does Genesis 1:1, is that the title or the preview of what's coming through the rest of the chapter, or is that its own separate thing? Now Sailhamer argues, and he argues two things. First, he argues that these are actually two separate events. That in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is actually telling us when and how God created the heavens and the earth. He did it in the beginning. And notice that he doesn't tell us how he did it or how long he took to do it. There was a period of time called the beginning in which God created the heavens and the earth. And that would explain then in verse 2 why there's already an earth. So Sailhamer is going to argue first that these are two separate events. He's going to do something in verse 1 that creates the universe, and then do something in verse 2 that does something with the universe, particularly a piece of land that God has already created in verse 1. I hope you're tracking with me and this is making sense. So Sailhamer's first argument is that the first verse of the Bible is actually describing the creation of the universe, separately from what God's about to do in verse 2. And so in verse 1, in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. Now, there are two, and I'm sure he gives much more thorough defenses of this in other places, but I picked up two reasons in Genesis Unbound why he thinks that instead of the traditional reading, which is, no, verse 1 is just describing what's about to happen in the rest of chapter 1. And then verse 2 then is the beginning of him creating the heavens and the earth. He says that, from what I read and understand, and I could be dead wrong, but there are two reasons why he holds that there are two separate events instead of one, and that verse 1 is the creation of the universe. First of all, he says, where if verse 1 is just God kind of announcing, this is what I'm about to do, and then in verse 2, he begins creating, but we already have an earth that is created, and we have water that covers, and darkness that covers the surface of the deep, that wars against a very important, not only Jewish but Christian idea that God created out of nothing, that the universe isn't eternal, that God's the only thing that is eternal, the universe isn't eternal, and that God's creation is different from humanity's kind of creating, because God can create out of nothing. And so Sailhamer's point is, well, look, if you say in chapter 1, verse 1, that verse, God created the heavens and the earth, is just announcing what's about to happen. And then in verse 2, well, the earth is formless and void, then that sort of erodes the idea that God created out of nothing. Where'd the earth come from to begin with? So one argument is just kind of a common sense, like the better reading, which makes more sense of verse 2, is to simply say, well, in verse 1, God creates the heavens and the earth. He creates the sky and the land. He creates, it's called a merism, according to my friend Jeff Volkmer. Heavens and earth is kind of like saying from A to Z and everything in between. It's like stating the extremes of something. That means he's created everything. And then in chapter 2, God does something different. He takes what's already been created and begins to fashion it specifically for the purpose of human habitation. Now, what Sailhamer is going to argue, and I'm not going to get into today, is that what God is going to do over the next 6 days is that God is going to fashion the promised land for human habitation. So he's not talking, because when you read God created the heavens and the earth, the word earth there doesn't mean globe. The word earth there means land. And Sailhamer will give an account for why it is that he actually thinks that what the text is saying is that God has created the earth, but he's now going to take a piece of land and he's going to form that into a temple garden, a temple with a garden. And he's going to make it fit for human habitation. So he's got to do something about darkness. He creates light and time and measuring time. He's got to do something about the water, so he brings forth land, and he calls forth animals and birds and to fill this particular land. And then he nestles the human being in there with the idea that they're to fill the earth and one scholar says almost to expand the borders of Eden. So Eden was the promised land. In fact, what Sailhamer argues, which is totally fascinating to a Bible geek like me, is that the Garden of Eden was actually in the promised land. And so when Abram in Genesis 12 is called back, what the land that God promises him is actually where the Garden of Eden actually was. And so the idea is that God creates the promised land for Adam and Eve. He calls that Eden. Then our first parents sin. They're kicked out. They're exiled to the east. Abram, after generations, is called from the east to go back to the land. And Sailhamer and others argue that land is actually where Eden was. And although we don't see it as Eden because of the sin and death that has entered the world and the angel that is guarding the tree of life, and however you take that, but it's a fascinating idea that what the next 6 days are going to be about is that these are 6 literal 24-hour periods where God isn't creating the universe, but he's actually taking what he's created and he's fashioning it to make it fit for human habitation. And he's doing it along temple lines. He's doing it the way that ancient temples were made, dedicated. At the center of ancient temples would be a garden. And so it's absolutely fascinating. If I lost you, I'm so sorry. I just had to geek out a moment for how cool this is, because the idea would be that God created Adam and Eve for the Garden of Eden. They're exiled from Eden, and then Abram is brought back to that same piece of land. that same piece of land that's fought over today was actually the place where God intended human beings to serve as priests and workers and co-regents in the administration of creation under God's good authority. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. But that doesn't deal with Sailhamer's main point, which is, okay, these are two events. Now, his first reason for thinking these are two events is that, listen, if this is all one event, then where the heck's the earth come from? Why do we start with the earth was formless and void when it doesn't give us any indication of God creating the earth? If you just started in chapter 1, verse 2 as the creation account, then you would think the earth was already there. And so that's not going to work theologically. The second reason he gives, and this one, if you thought the stuff I just covered was a bit thick, this is even more thick. So I'll do my best. But if I don't convey it well enough, read his book. He's also got another book that I love called The Pentateuch is Narrative. Pentateuch is a way that Christians refer to the first 5 books of the Bible, what the Jews call the Torah. Anyway, check those out. But here's the second reason he gives why Genesis 1 is one whole event and Genesis 2 is a different event. Or Genesis 1:1 is one event, Genesis 1:2 is a separate event. All right? The word that we translate in the beginning is one word, and it includes the word reshit, and it's literally spelled reshit. So it's pronounced reshit, evidently, and it is a very ambiguous term. It's a way now, and this is so stinking important. It is a way of speaking of a period of time before something that we're interested in happens. Tim Mackey defines it like this: Reshit is a way of talking about an undetermined period of time in the past where something important took place, but now we want to get the story going. So now we're going to count something, but before we start counting, there was something that happened, and we call that in the beginning. Most of us, when we hear the word beginning, we think starting point. Like there was nothing before the beginning, that's why it's called the beginning, but Reshit doesn't mean that. Reshit, because there are other Hebrew words that could mean like the first thing God did was create the universe. This, Reshit here, when we talk about in the beginning, first of all, it's fascinating because in Hebrew there is no definite article. And so you have literally, it's rendered in beginning or at the head of. And so in English, we supply the. In the beginning, as if there were just one. Whereas Reshit can mean beginning not as the start of a sequence, but rather as the period of time before a sequence starts. So I know this is so crazy and I'm so sorry. Here's the idea. That the beginning can refer to an extended period of time before the thing that we're interested in and counting begins. So it's kind of like pregnancy, all right? We count the person's birthday on the day they are born. When we would say metaphysically they exist before that, correct? Whether, and I don't want to get into big trimester debates, but let's say that you're a thing from conception to birth. Like you are human something. You are a human person, however you want to describe it. I don't want to get into that whole debate, but just I want to kind of give an example of Reshit. That 9-month time that you are in utero would be called the beginning in biblical terms, using Reshit. We don't start counting until you are born, and then we start counting forward. But that period of time before we start counting would be Reshit. It would be the beginning. Another example that Sailhamer uses is that Hebrew kings, the dates of their reign in the Old Testament were often reckoned from the beginning of the beginning of the Hebrew year. So if you took office like 6 months before the beginning of the Hebrew year, the duration of your reign was calculated only from the beginning of the Hebrew year forward, and the part where you were reigning and you were actually king 6 months before the beginning of the new year, that was called the beginning, or the early years of your reign. Job, in the book of Job, Job's prior life, before all of this tragedy comes upon him, was called the beginning, the early part of Job's life. It was the Reshit. So it doesn't mean like a singular point in time. See, we hear beginning, we think, boom, there was a singular point in time. There was nothing prior to that. And then bam, everything happens. In the beginning, Reshit in the Old Testament is often used to describe a long period of time that took place before the thing we're interested in happened, and the thing we're counting now is happening. So you're in utero for 9 months, but we don't start counting your life until you are born. So in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, you would call that early part Reshit. That would be in the beginning. That would be your early life, right? That would be like the early part of a king's reign that's not counted, but the king is still actually reigning and ruling. Now, I hope, my Lord, I hope this is beginning to make sense. Sailhamer says Reshit refers to an extended yet indeterminate period of time, not a specific moment. It is a block of time which precedes an extended series of time periods. So what he's saying is, when it says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, his first argument is that no, these are two separate events. God is actually creating in chapter 1, verse 1. So that when we get to chapter 1, verse 2, and there's the earth, well, that's already been created in verse 1. It's a separate event. And one argument he gives for this is the meaning of the word beginning. In English, it's in the beginning, and that just reinforces to our English mind that was a moment in time. Whereas Reshit, as it's used in the Old Testament, actually refers to a block of time that happened before the thing we're interested in happened. And very often what will happen is Reshit will be used to summarize something that happened, and then we'll count in a series the thing we're interested in talking about. So in the Genesis narrative, Reshit is used to just describe the creation of the universe. It tells us nothing about how it was done. It tells us nothing about when it was done. And it tells us nothing about how long it took to be done. So all of the debates we have about the age of the universe, and is it 4,000 or 6,000 or billions of years old, the author tells us nothing at all about any of this. We don't know. It doesn't say anything about how God did it or how long he took to do it. All of these massive, like faith destroying debates, the text isn't even answering. That's why this is so important. We have no idea how he created the heavens and the earth. We have no idea. None. The author isn't interested in that. The author is interested in the numeric sequence that's coming, this numeric sequence of 7, that, and again, this is a separate argument, but that according to Sailhamer is going to describe the taking of the land and making it fit for human habitation, and then nestling humans in there and inviting them to work and rest in the same pattern that God himself displayed. And so if that's how you understand Genesis 1, then all of the cosmological and evolutionary debates we have are absolutely pointless, not because they're not important, but because the author has no interest in telling us anything about how this took place. All the author says is in beginning, right at the head, before God started creating, the heavens and the earth were created. Now the earth was formless and void. And now we're going to talk about and earth means land in this instance. And so to me, this is absolutely mind-blowing because, like I said, as I grew up, one of the biggest threats to faith was evolution. And so, you just had massive amounts of how does Genesis 1 fit into modern cosmology? And the assumption was that Genesis 1 was giving cosmology. When if Sailhamer's right, what Genesis 1 is doing is it's just announcing that there is one God, and this one God created the universe. And then this one God, out of the universe that God created, decided to create image bearers. And to do that, he fashioned a place for them to live, specifically designed for them, for their habitation. And so there were animals, and there were plants, and the darkness had to be dealt with, so there was light, and then the water had to be dealt with, so there was land. And I mean, it makes total sense then that when we go to Genesis, what we're not doing is we're reading about an ancient cosmological account. What we're reading instead is an account about who God is, why it is that we operate in a 6-day work week, 1-day Sabbath cycle, and then the fact that God created this specific land for all humanity. That the promised land given to Israel was the original garden that was given to the first humans. And when the Bible ends with a new heavens and a new earth, and a new city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven to rest on the earth, well, the idea is that's where it rests. That God now just goes, that the end of the world is very much like the beginning of the world. And that instead of a garden, now there'll be a city, and God will dwell with his people just like he always intended to. So it's fascinating, and I don't know if it's fascinating to you. It's fascinating to me how that one word can reframe massive debates. Now, there are people, of course, that disagree with Sailhamer and understand this in a different way. I just wanted to present his side of things because it was so revealing to me and absolutely fascinating to think about. And if he's right, it completely reframes so many of the science debates that we have around the idea of faith. So, for those of you who are students in the sciences, for those of you who are scientists or science teachers, and you feel this fundamental conflict, I just want to say, well, there's actually a way to understand this where these things don't conflict at all. And I think that's beautiful. So anyway, food for thought. Today, you guys are always amazing. Thank you for emailing questions. I have so many to answer, but our website is voxpodcast.com. The email is hello@voxpodcast.com. We're in the middle of a Revelation series that we're doing as a reward to some of our Patreon supporters. If you're not familiar with Patreon, it is a way to financially support creators, and that can be art, that can be writing, that can be podcasting. You get rewards for various levels of participation, and for one, we're doing the book of Revelation, which is absolutely fascinating in its own right. But these are people that are very committed to seeing this podcast continue, and so grateful for their support. If you want to join them, you can go on to patreon.com and look up the Vox Podcast or Mike Erre. Anyway, brothers and sisters, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance to you, and may he give you peace in these days. Thank you so very much.